It's time to listen in to the stories for crossroads of business and family on the Got Family Show with Carrie Berger. Whether you're in the business of your own or want to be, this is a show where changes happen. Now, here's Carrie Berger.
Hello and welcome to Got Family. This is Carrie Berger on thevoiceoflawrence.com. And as usual, we start off with telling you a little bit what I'm up to this week. Wednesday of this week, I'll be heading off to the desert, and I'll be working with a client there. In that particular case, what we're talking about is the sale of an asset. And in that sale of an asset, as opposed to stock sale, by the way, for those of you who keep track of the tax distinction there, sale of an asset means that you're selling the underlying items. You're selling the real estate or the contracts or the widgets, whatever those may be. Conversely, a stock sale means that if I've got a corporation or an LLC or some other entity, I'm selling the entity itself. I buy shares of the stock, and the stock then represents the company, and the company owns those assets. I still get the assets, but I get the whole kit and caboodle. The difference between the two really comes down to a couple of things. One of them is a tax impact, which we're going to talk about in a second, which is what I'm going to the desert for. But the other one is a liability question. An entity has a life of its own, and it holds its own liability for its actions. So the corporation has that liability potentially. The reason why you do that is because it holds it and you don't individually. That's why you created the corporation or the LLC, limited liability company, in the first place. So if you sell the entity, a stock purchase, so to speak, then you also are selling that liability. If the person who buys it later discovers, oh my, there's a lawsuit pending against the company, he bought the company, he owns that lawsuit that comes against him. If, on the other hand, he bought all the underlying widgets, then that doesn't matter that somebody's suing the company. He didn't buy the company, he just bought the widgets. So anyhow, that's the discussion on the liability side. What I'm talking about, though, is the tax side. It's called a like-kind exchange that we're going out there to talk about. What happens is that if you own something, it may have a, for lack of a better word, pent-up taxability, so to speak. There's value that's subject to taxation. I bought this thing for a dime. I'm now going to sell it for $1, and the IRS says, great, you owe taxes on the gain, which is capital gains, of 90 cents. And so that's what you're dealing with. Okay, fine. If you can take an asset and say, well, I didn't actually, again, I'm paraphrasing here, but I didn't actually sell it for $1. I traded it for something just like it. I just went from one widget to another widget. Usually it's done with real estate. And so what happens then is that if you can say that I've made a like-kind exchange from one widget to another widget, or one piece of real estate to another piece of real estate, then I have not had a realization event of that capital gains, and thus I'm not subject to the capital gains tax. So what you want to do in that situation is intentionally trade for a like-kind asset that you do want to be invested in, and then avoid paying the taxes until such time as you actually do trade that asset for cash. Trading for another asset didn't trigger it, no taxes, and every day of tax deferral is a good day in that sense, because you're able to get interest on the full value, or get increased value in that asset on the full amount instead of the amount after taxes. A good example would be this. I've got a piece of property. I'm going to sell it for $100. I'm going to pay capital gains taxes. Let's go ahead and call it 23%. There's a long discussion of whether that involves the state and the federal, and the other 3.5% that is often called the Obama tax. But ignoring that, let's just say 23%. And so my net effect would be that after I sold that $100 item, I now have a $77 value, right? In my pocket. I've got that much cash. Great, no problem. I then can go ahead and use that $77 to buy something else. Okie dokie. Conversely, with a like-kind exchange, I have that $100 item, and I would go ahead and trade for another $100 item. And I have not experienced the capital gains at this time. I don't have to buy a $77 item, I buy a $100 item. That's the difference. That's the power of the like-kind exchange. Now, at some point, we still have to figure out what is your basis and what is the capital gain that comes on that when you do finally sell it for cash. But every day that it's not officially a transition to cash is one more day when you get to get the value of increased value and interest earned on the full amount of that $100. So anyhow, that is like-kind exchange, and that is how it relates to an asset sale. Oftentimes it has to do with real estate, and that's what I'm working on this week. Well, the rest of the story will be all about you and what happens as you live here at the crossroads of business and family. And our first snippet will come up right after this break. We'll see you shortly here on thevoiceoflawrence.com. I'm Kerry Berger for Got Family. Welcome back to Got Family. This is Kerry Berger, and we're on thevoiceoflawrence.com. Our first snippet for today is somebody who is actively operating their business very successfully, and they've got a situation where they're kind of wondering, can I get a little more rest? Let's hear what he has to say.
I run a business that's open 24/7. I've been running it for many years, and I'm not sure I've had a full night's sleep in 6 years, and I'd really like one. Any ideas?
Well, that's always interesting. You do, of course, realize that sleep deprivation is one of the most effective tools they use in torture, and you are effectively torturing yourself on a daily basis as you deprive yourself of this sleep. Unfortunately, I'm guessing that our friend, well, I'm not guessing, I happen to know the case, so I know he's not doing it on purpose. He doesn't want to miss the sleep. What is happening is he's convinced himself he doesn't have another choice. So let's talk just a little bit about that. As you run your own business, you often will hear the analogy that it's your baby. And that really is a very good analogy. You do remember the days, if you have children, when they were little and how, the newborn didn't let you sleep through the night. Same thing goes for your newborn business, and that is very common if your business happens to be one that does involve 24-hour service of some sort. But like that newborn, at some point, you need to help the child to grow up and to be able to understand what it means to sleep through the night and let you sleep through the night. I remember vividly with my eldest son how it was very difficult to let him cry, so to speak, and know he was okay. And it was much harder on us, I think, than it was on him. And we basically wound up in that case when we realized, okay, we're quite confident, he's clean, he's fed, he's got everything, he's safe. I remember literally sitting outside the door so he couldn't see us, but we could sort of peek in and make sure he was safe. And we were just terrified and listened to him cry until eventually he said, well, fine. He laid down, he went to sleep. It's a lot like that oftentimes with your baby, the business. Your employees have been trained by you that you want to know about it. And so every time something goes on, you reinforce that behavior of waking you up by saying, well, what's happening? And if they don't tell you about it, then why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you? And you've just encouraged the behavior, the same as a parent with a young child may accidentally be reinforcing the crying by every time the crying happens, they run into the room and reinforce that behavior. Same thing happens here, but it's hard because this is your life, and just as that child is your life, so too your business represents so much of your life and your family's health and safety. So the temptation is always to say, of course you can call me. The problem is, much like with that baby, is that at some point you're harming your business just as you would be harming your child if you didn't teach them to find their own solutions, didn't teach them to find their own happy place, if you will, learn how to take care of it on their own. And it is called empowerment, and that is a way overused word. It goes back, I'm not sure how far, but I know I remember hearing it in the 70s and the 80s, and I'm sure it was long before then. And you do have to simply empower them to take care of the problems. That's the first key to all of this. Second thing that goes along with getting yourself a good night's sleep is, as you're empowering them, you have to reinforce the behaviors of them doing it on their own, even when they didn't do it exactly the way you would like. That's the other hard lesson for so many of us. Part of the reason why you're an entrepreneur is because you are a strong-willed person. You have strong, high standards, and you want things done right. This is your responsibility. You're going to do it right. So what happens is when something goes not quite right, or they handle it not exactly the way you would, you maybe give them negative feedback saying, well, you should have done this, you could have done that. You're going to have to just get through that and train them and reinforce them positively for the things they did right. Say, yeah, you could have done a little better, but you know what? Thanks for what you did. That was a good job. That sounds so simplistic, and I realize that is a very simplistic discussion, but that's the first step towards getting that night's sleep. And we'll talk more about some other questions as we get to more of his concerns right after this break. This is Kerry Berger on Got Family on thevoiceoflawrence.com. See you in a moment. Welcome back to Got Family. This is Kerry Berger, and we are on thevoiceoflawrence.com. By the way, you can get a hold of us at thevoiceoflawrence.com or gotfamilyradio.com, and we're by calling 1-844-GOT-FAMILY, GOT-FMLY. Our snippet of the day continues, and let's hear what he has to say now.
Yeah, I've tried all of that. I trust my employees, and I do reinforce them. But somebody ultimately has to be in charge. Somebody has to be the boss. That's why I keep doing this.
Well, our friend here is correct. Somebody does have to be the boss. That is the truth of the matter. Is the old saying, the buck stops here. That is absolutely the truth. You are the entrepreneur, and ultimately, if indeed something goes down or up or sideways or on fire, it stops all over you, and you're responsible for that. So I get that. So yes, ultimately the buck stops with you. But what happens next is a question of checks and balances. And it ties into our first conversation, our somewhat simplistic conversation of letting the baby sleep sometimes and not reinforcing them bothering you at all times. But it goes to another level, and this is the second level. There will be a third, I'll just tell you in advance. Second one is checks and balances. And what happens in this situation is that you find yourself saying, I have to know everything. Well, that may be true, but someone needs to also know it in addition to you. And then the two of you can become checks and balances for each other, right? That applies to finances, applies to leadership, and of course, as in the earlier example, it applies to parenting, if you will, too. We're still parenting this baby, which is our business. So let's talk about that. One of the surest, well, I don't know who to quote on this, but I recall years ago reading an article that talked about the most sure way to make certain that you have a problem with your finances is to separate the person who's doing the spending from the person who's managing the money. Because the one who's managing the money is aware there's a problem, but he's not the one responsible for the spending. And the person who's spending is sort of peripherally aware of the money that's being managed, but they're not really involved with it directly. And so that separation winds up leading to problems, okay? Well, that's an example of a lack of checks and balances. That's also an example of a lack of communication, but let's go to that another time. So checks and balances in the financial way, it really comes down to allowing the employee who is responsible for a given task to understand the finances involved with it. Let them be responsible for a piece of the budgeting. Let them be responsible for the success and failure. And when I say responsible, consider it also both in the negative and the positive sense. This is where you have the opportunity to reinforce behaviors, in this case, with bonuses or attaboys or cash of some sort. How they're paid is reflected of their performance. Simple stuff once again. But that gives them a responsibility and then allows you to be in a secondary role of checking up on checks and balances. You can take that further, of course, if you've got a large organization and have different people checking on different people. We're not talking about creating a series of spies within your organization and making people uncomfortable. We're talking about just helping people to know that somebody's got their back. Now, when it comes to leadership and answering those questions we talked about a moment ago of letting you sleep through the night, same idea. Checks and balances are a little bit of redundancy that doesn't always have to involve you. You don't have to be the only one who receives it. So, like as if my opinion matters, and I realize it doesn't, but nonetheless, give yourself permission to be able to sleep. Give yourself permission to let somebody else look at these things. Do still let the buck stop here. Do still provide a final review, but maybe you're the second or the third review of the question as opposed to the first. It leads to a lot of positive things in your operating business, both in terms of being able to have a little peace and also in terms of having some sense of commitment and involvement by those who are working with and for you so that everybody's on the same page. Again, fairly basic stuff, but it's the next level beyond letting the baby sleep. There's a third we'll talk about in a minute. In the meantime, though, we're going to go to a caller, and we're going to do that right after we take a break. This is Kerry Berger, this is the voiceoflawrence.com, and this is the Got Family Radio Show. See you in a minute. Welcome back to the Got Family Show with Kerry Berger and the voiceoflawrence.com. I said as we left that we were going to have a caller. I actually sort of misspoke. What I really meant was we're going to have another email. This one came into thevoiceoflawrence.com, and our friendly producer voice is going to read it to you right now.
Hi, Carrie. I got a quick question for you. What is my business worth? Thanks.
Well, that was short and sweet, and a question that probably many of us have asked many times. What is my business really worth? Well, the true definition of value of any sort is always the same. It starts with one question. What would a willing buyer and a willing seller agree to in an arm's length transaction? Let's go through the pieces. A willing buyer, someone who's not forced to, with gun to his head, so to speak. A willing seller, same thing. They both want to make this happen. They're not being forced to or begrudgingly agreeing to it. They want this to happen in a normal, willing sense. Agree to an arm's length transaction. Again, no coercion, no unusual circumstances, just willing buyer, willing seller, arm's length transaction. Okay, that's the definition. Well, in that sense, then you would only really know what it's worth once somebody actually writes that check and it clears the bank. And even then you wouldn't know for sure, because theoretically there might have been another willing buyer that would pay you more, which means you didn't get the, quote, full value. So, how do we get something that tells us that answer with actually going through the sale? How do we get this feeling for what direction we're going with our business? What you do is you go through the same kind of analysis that a buyer should go through in buying a business. And I'm going to give you three real simple concepts that you can apply. The first one is going to be a multiple of sales, for lack of a better word. Depending upon your type of business, you may say, okay, my business is in this industry, and as such, my sales are $100, and and the multiple will be 4 times sales. How do we get to that? Well, first of all, you would normally just good old Google, you would find out what kind of multiples, what kind of methodologies are used in your industry. Isn't a bad place to start, and that'll get you kind of there. The multiples usually are going to be something between 3 and 12 times. They may be as little as 1 or 2 or as closer to 12. Conceptually, that's accurate. Let me tell you the way you run up and down that line. That's probably the better question than the specifics. If you have a business that has a lot of potential risk, that it may not be able to produce those numbers again, then the number of multiples will be smaller, right? So I would take a 1 time or 2 times the whatever that number is we're multiplying. I'm going to talk about that more in a moment. If, on the other hand, you have a business that is very stable and consistently makes this much money, and they know they can count on it forever and ever, amen, great, then you're going to get a higher multiple, 4, 5, 6, 7 number, etc. If you have a business, even better still, that is not only strong and stable, but for this particular buyer, it's the difference between them being able to make money not only on your business, but on their own, then you have a unique situation where the multiples do start heading towards the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 range, okay? Now we have to go back to, I said, of sales. Sales isn't exactly accurate. There's a lot of different numbers we can use. Probably the best one to use is one that's called EBITDA. EBITDA. Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and accumulation. It's a technical term. Look it up again, EBITDA. When you look it up, what you'll find is that even that is not exactly magical, because we have to adjust EBITDA. Short and the long of it is this. What would, in a generic textbook sense, this business be able to produce in the way of income if it had normal expenses and these earnings? Okay, so normal expenses for this business, nothing unusual happening, and the earnings that you have received. So what happens there is, if you've been taking money out to pay for your car, and a normal business would not be required to do that, then you would be able to add that back into your number to make a higher EBITDA and thus a higher multiple. Conversely, if you've not been paying yourself as you work 60 hours a week, then you would have to add that back in and subtract that from your EBITDA, because that money would have to be spent to pay somebody to work those hours, and in doing so, that would reduce your EBITDA that you're multiplying. Okay? Kind of that makes sense. So we get the idea of the multiple, we get the idea of what you're multiplying, and then sort of the last concept that may help get you there. Think of it this way. Even if you're not borrowing the money to buy the business, you're using money that could otherwise have been invested someplace else, right? So if someone's buying your business, they've either got to go to the bank or they've got to take money out of the bank, and somebody's got to pay that interest or the lost opportunity that would have happened with your own cash, right? So the normal concept here is going to be something like 5 to 7 years to repay the purchase price with interest. So if you use a real simple analysis, I can, after paying all expenses, produce this much cash, and this much cash can be applied towards the loan, or whatever you want to call it. Use the loan, it's the easiest example. That loan will be paid off, principal and interest, in 7 years, based upon a reasonable interest rate. That'll get you pretty doggone close. So, what's my business worth? It's a complicated answer, but it's better than just saying the real answer, which is whatever a willing buyer and a willing seller will agree to an arm's length transaction. We at least gave you a little bit of an idea. Last question or thought on that is, why do we care? And I'll tell you why you care, because if indeed this is what you're investing your money in to keep this business going, and you're trying to decide, should I leave the cash in there or take it out and put it someplace else, you need to have some idea of the return on your cash that you're leaving in your business. And the increase in your value, as well as any distributions or dividends beyond your salary, that's the return on the money you've got in that business. If all you get is a flat value and a salary that's consistent with what you could have earned someplace else, then all you've done is bought yourself a job. And you might do better off to get a job and then take the money that the business is able to be sold for and put that into some other form of investment that allows it to get a return on that money. Does that make sense? So that's the reason why we do want to know and why it does matter for all of us running businesses. It's enough for today. That got a little complicated. We're ready for one more break, and this is the Got Family Radio Show with Carrie Berger on thevoiceoflawrence.com. Welcome back to the Got Family Radio Show. I am Carrie Berger, and this is thevoiceoflawrence.com. Again, please look us up on Facebook and Twitter at Got Family Radio. We are going to return to our snippet for our third piece of this puzzle, and now let's hear what he's asking about next.
Okay, fine. I understand checks and balances, and I've been doing it for a while. I'm actually at the point now where I'm thinking about a board of directors. I know board of directors is generally for the big boys, but does this apply to me and my business?
Welcome back. Now there is our third and final question from our snippet, and in some ways it really does just keep showing the evolution of a business. Starts off as we did in the first discussion with a newborn infant, then we go on to being able to expand that and have others taking the responsibility and checks and balances, and now we're finally at that stage where we're saying, well, I've heard about this thing, and the thing he's talking about is a board of directors. Most closely held businesses, until they get to some fairly substantial size, do not run a true board of directors. But at the same time, the funny thing is they actually do. It's just that it's informal. It's a board of directors that involves them and a hand mirror, or it involves them and their spouse, or them and their employees, and that's fine. The question isn't whether or not you need a board of directors. The question is, how formal does it need to be? That's the real question here. And that is a very good question. That's that next level of evolution. So let's go ahead and describe a fairly formal but average formality level for a closely held business, okay? We have a board of directors that has X number of members, let's say it's 5, 3 of which are what we would call insiders, meaning they are either the president of the company or the person who does the financing, the books, the CFO, or it's the key employee. There's 3 of us that are insiders, and we have 2 of us that are outsiders. And the outsiders are people you brought to the board as they're not employees, they're not stockholders, they are truly outsiders. That is a board of directors, as many people would recognize. We have meetings that occur probably, at least initially, a few times a year, but at some point it settles down to probably 3 to 5 times a year. If you're having a board of directors meeting once a year, you're not really having a board of directors meeting. what you're having is a rubber stamp session, because there's so many other business decisions that have been made during that year that obviously if you're only holding one meeting a year, you're just doing it to say you did. That's not really a board of directors, okay? True board of directors would be involved whenever there were larger strategic directional type of decisions being made, and they would then pass that information down to the executive team that runs the business, okay? Normally that's going to take at least quarterly, and then as needed, special meetings beyond that, okay? So now we have a couple of questions. The first question is, all right, boy, that's really interesting, but why do I want one? Why you want one is the third step of this evolution we've been talking about, and that is that when you are running your business successfully and you are in the, let's just say, the president's role, for lack of a better word, you are at the ground low. You are seeing the business from right there in the trenches. That's great. And you will do your best to lift your head up out of those trenches and to get a larger picture of what's going on. That's great, but it's hard to do both. At the very least, hopefully, you are taking time on a maybe annual or maybe hopefully more often quarterly basis to ask yourself, why am I doing what am I doing? Where am I going? What's the direction? What's my strategic plan, etc. But still, you're talking to yourself, right? So that's where the board of directors comes in. When you start getting to the place where there's more than just putting out fires happening in this business, you're actually making larger decisions. Should I go left? Should I go right? Should I hit the accelerator? Should I tap the brakes? Those bigger decisions, those bigger strategic decisions, it's nice to have the input of somebody in addition to yourself. You still, of course, would participate in that, but that's what that board does for you. They don't have the same level of emotions. That's why you're on there. You've got your heart to show for it. They don't have your same experience. That's why you're there to share that knowledge that you have. But they've got their own experience, and that's how you're going to choose them to be on it. So that's the value of it. Then I've told you about the number of meetings, if you will. Now let's talk about who you would put on there. I would suggest that you do have at least one, ideally more than one outsider. Generally speaking, they will be the minority, but nonetheless, you would have an outsider or two. And that outsider or those outsiders come to the board because they have knowledge. Now, you're not trying to just get free advice. You don't put your attorney on there or your banker on there just so you can ask them free advice when you're off their professional clock. That's not the point. You can buy that time. Besides, the board members are normally not going to be free. We'll talk about that in a minute, how much you pay them. So what is it? Well, what it is that you're going to choose your board members, probably people who are in your industry or similar industries, either in your area or some distance. People often will limit themselves to just their own town, saying, oh, I can't ask somebody to come in out of town. Why not? You know, a plane ticket from many of the nearby towns, maybe $200. That's not a bad price to pay if you're at a place where they're giving you advice that may be worth many zeros more than that in terms of how you're running your business. So the money you spend on their expenses, if they're the right person, is money well spent. Then the question becomes, how much do you pay them beyond that? The way we normally calculate that is pretty simple. You would say, how much would I have to pay somebody to be the president of this company on an annual basis? Then, how many hours would I ask them to work? Then, that becomes sort of the hourly rate for that high-level leadership that I'm asking of this person as president. You're asking for a similar high-level leadership for a person in a board position, so you kind of give them that same kind of an hourly rate. Now, how many hours are you paying them for? Normally, we don't want to literally pay them by the hour because it starts to backfire. You begin to look at your watch and say, oh, if we can make this happen quicker, then it'll cost me less. No, that's not what you want. You want to take all the time you need to answer these questions and have these discussions. So you don't really want an hourly rate board. Instead, you have a flat rate, usually a fee per meeting or per year based upon a minimum of X number of meetings or a maximum of Y number of meetings. And that's what they're going to be paid. And when you're calculating that, you use that hourly I mentioned, and don't forget to allow not only the time for the meetings themselves, but for all the prep work for it. They have to be ready to converse with you intelligently on the topics. They have to prepare the studies that need to be used in making this decision. That takes time. So usually we think of it as 1 to 2 days in addition to the day of the meeting before the meeting, and 1 to 2 days in addition to the day of the meeting after the meeting for follow-through. Okay? Last piece on a board. Don't start it if you're not going to do the work necessary, because the work necessary is this. If you're going to have a board meeting, then not less than a week, ideally many weeks before the meeting happens, you have to have an agenda and you have to have assignments. Okay, we're going to talk about blank. Who's going to get us all the data on how other people do blank? Once you know that that data is there, get it shipped out in a board packet in that week to 2 or many more as you can prior to the meeting so that people can study it. That's why you're paying them in advance, because they need to study it, right? Everybody then has done the studying before they show up. They come prepared to talk, and it's kind of like a book club. It only works if everybody read the book, right? So that's what we're talking about in terms of a board packet and board prep and the amount of time it takes to do it. The beauty of it is you will find great comfort in having a board of directors being able to sometimes validate what it is you thought and sometimes challenge what it is you're thinking. Last piece. Nobody starts off with a true board of directors once they get into a board setting. They start off with a board of advisors. The difference is this. Board of advisors gives you good advice and you say, I'll listen to that and I'll make my own decision. Most entrepreneurs, that's as far as they ever get. Someday, if you get beyond the entrepreneurial phase, you may have a true board of directors. That's where you've given them power to literally say, this will happen, and you can't really say no. There's a lot of technicalities, what I mean by can and can't, etc. But let's just, for emotional purposes, think of it as a difference between they give me advice and I may take it, or they tell me what I need to do and I really kind of have to do what they tell me, even though they may technically not be able to force you. So that's enough about that. That is that next level. See how we went all the way from the very basic stuff to something that may be a little beyond what you're thinking of currently. And we talked a little bit about it from the financial point of view as well as from a structural and from a personal point of view of how it is that it feels and why you would choose to bring it on. That's how we do everything here. We look at everything from a personal, financial, structural point of view, and we try to figure out how does this really work while we're living here at the crossroads of business and family. Let's take a break, and we'll return to the Got Family Radio Show. I'm Kerry Berger, and we are on thevoiceoflawrence.com. Welcome back to the Got Family Radio Show. I'm Kerry Berger, and we are on thevoiceoflawrence.com. Through thevoiceoflawrence.com and the Twitter connection at Got Family Radio, we received a message, pretty simple. He said, how do I know when I'm going to be taxed? Wow, what a question. I don't know exactly. I'm just looking at the word. I think I know what he means. What I think he's saying is this. Some things are taxable, some things are not. How do I have a general rule of what is going to be taxable in my world? Interesting. Well, I'll give you a general rule. I have a truism that I often use, and that is this. The IRS knows two types of money. Money they have taxed and money they're going to tax. Now that sounds sort of smart-alecky, but it really isn't. It actually is very helpful when you think about it. Think of it this way. The IRS has not yet received their money. They're going to receive their money sometime. It's either now or later. And so when you're trying to figure out in a given situation, is this taxable, ask yourself, has it been taxed yet? Or will it be taxed in the future? So you can have an idea of whether it's going to be taxed in this situation. All right? So let's take an example. I buy a house. I use money to buy the house that I already paid taxes on, right? I earned a salary or I earned a profit, I made money, I paid my taxes on that money, right? Now that I paid my tax on the money, that's money that has been taxed. I then buy the house with it. That now is my basis or my principal or my whatever you want to call it. That is my starter money. That's the money I put in and it's already been taxed, right? Now, when I go to sell this thing, that is my basis or purposes of capital gains, because it's already been taxed. The part that hasn't been taxed is the fact that I bought the house for my classic $100, and I'm now selling it for $175. How much am I going to be taxed on? Well, $75, because 100 I already got taxed on in the way of paying taxes on my salary, and it was my basis. 75 I haven't yet been taxed on because it's growth, and it hasn't yet been taxed. Kind of simple rule. It'll help you also when you're talking about qualified plans and when they are taxed or not. It'll help you with all sorts of other discussions. Like I said, it sounds a little smart alecky, and I apologize, but remember, the IRS knows two types of money: money they have taxed and money they're going to tax. We have one last discussion, and I want to go ahead and go into this as kind of an overview of a lot of questions I get a lot of times. People will say, do I have the right personality to be an entrepreneur? Or I'm worried about this, or I'm thinking about this, or whatever. And we get a lot of discussions of personality types for different stages in the business world. The startup phase in particular, I will start with giving you a, I'm not sure if this is going to give you hope or fear, but it's just what it is. I will say that of the vast majority of first generation or entrepreneurial people that I work with, they are pretty heavily ADD. Attention deficit disorder. It's not a dirty word, it's okay. ADD in the sense that their mind just works in such a way that they can have a number of things happening all at the same time. They would be great sideshow artists spinning plates, right? They get them all going, and they can keep them all going, and they can pay attention to these multiple plates. Now, unfortunately, they may not be good at paying attention to any one of them at great length, which is why this plate spinning works really well for them, which is why entrepreneurs tend to work really well. And that's like the reason why that matters is because, think about it. As an entrepreneur, you're making this stuff up. You sort of think this is going to work, but you don't know for sure. So you got to try different things, right? Well, you try multiple different approaches to a given situation, and those multiple approaches, each of them have to have enough attention to give them a fighting chance. ADD works for you there. Now, here's the other part of the story, which is why many people who are great entrepreneurs do not do so well in maintaining and operating an ongoing business once it's up and running. Because remember earlier I said they don't necessarily like to focus on just that one task, doing it over and over again. They want to try something new. They want to keep trying different ideas. It can be used to your advantage, but that is at its core the most common personality trait and challenge that I see when I look at the difference between entrepreneurs and operators. How to use that to your advantage. Start by recognizing who you are. Know thyself. Whatever that is, whether you're technically, clinically ADD or not, I don't need to know that information, but you do need to know for yourself, how do I think best? Am I better with a single topic I focus on and just do it from beginning to end, put my nose to the grindstone and work really hard? Or am I better making a number of things happen, being creative, getting ideas started, and following them wherever they happen to take me? Differences make different strengths, different weaknesses. Then look at your coping mechanisms. Okay, I realize that I'm not real good at staying focused on it. That has to be handled. Even an entrepreneur, you still have to be able to take that plate that you've been spinning and realize that's the one, that's working. I need to do more of that in order to make more success, right? So you start building coping mechanisms. It may be, like our show talked about today, the coping mechanism of hiring other people, bringing other checks and balances and leaders and ideas and personalities to doing the job. That may be your coping mechanism. It may be that you use medication. It may also be that you have simply learned how to make things into smaller bites so that you can enjoy the diversity of the smaller bites, even though technically they're all part of a single picture with a single direction. Either way, your coping mechanisms are going to really matter. We all have them. We all have to have them because guess what? None of us are perfect. None of us have all the skills in all the areas and all the focus and all the attention that we need to have. So I'm offering this discussion on personality types, not as a psychologist, but from the point of view of what do I see? And what I see is, if you want to start a business, or if you are starting a business and you say, gee, sometimes I go all shiny. Yeah, exactly. That's fine. That's part of the personality. Then what are your coping mechanisms to let you keep focused? If, on the other hand, you recognize those same challenges and you realize you're really at the maintenance stage, how do I turn this otherwise operational job into something that fits with my personality as an entrepreneur and not have to start over again? That's another option. Or, again, how do I find somebody else to take this over who really is a good next generation or next leader of this business? Fun stuff. We'll talk about it more, and we'll talk about it with you when you call us or you send us a message. The methods of contacting us: leave a message on 844-GOT-FMLY, Got Family, or at gotfamilyradio.com or thevoiceoflawrence.com. Also Facebook and Twitter at Got Family Radio. This is Kerry Berger, and this is another one of our shows with stories from the crossroads of business and family. We'll see you next week.
For more information on Got Family, visit facebook.com/GotFamilyRadio. Check us out on Twitter at GotFamilyRadio. To leave a message for Kerry, call 844-GOT-FAMILY. That's 844-468-3659. This is Got Family Radio.